First, I just want to say it's a great honor to be here, and I want to thank the organizers, especially Matthew Lau, for having all of us here today. It is a great honor. The main problem that I think we face in trying to think about whether or not there are any moral implications to the kind of research that I and other people do that you'll be hearing about is this: that on the one hand we have laser seems, it's very faint. If anyone has a stronger laser pointer, let me know. We have questions about how we ought, let's see, is that better? Oh, good, thank you so much. Questions about how we ought to live, how we ought to behave, and then we have the messy world of cognitive science. And I think the standard view is that these things are just completely separate, that there's nothing that you can say about this stuff down here that has anything other than a trivial implication for our understanding about how things ought to be. And I actually take this line very seriously, and I'm not really interested in blurring it. Nevertheless, I do think that there is a bridge, and the bridge is moral intuition. Moral intuition is something that we rely on when we're thinking about what's right or what's wrong, and it's also a natural phenomenon, and one that at this time is very poorly understood. And so what I'm going to do today is try to give you an overview, at least from my own perspective, the perspective of my research, of the moral brain. And then in the final part of the talk, I'll talk about the ought stuff, and in particular about how I think a better understanding of moral psychology and moral intuition in particular can give us better ideas about how we ought to live, how we ought to behave. So this is the overall plan. I'm going to give an overview of what's been called the dual process theory of moral judgment, and some of the evidence supporting it, and then some more recent work giving a bit of a more subtle view of the process and focusing on this part of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what sets off these emotional responses, these gut reactions, these intuitions, and then finally, focusing on this, talk about how this research and this stuff in particular can have implications for ethics. So the guiding metaphor here is one that comes from this camera. This is the camera that I got for my birthday a few years ago. Now it's hardly out of date, but I still like it. And what's good about this camera, for a bumbler like me, is that it has two different photographic modes. So on the one hand, it has these automatic settings. So here's your landscape mode and your portrait mode. And for most purposes, I just use these point and shoot settings. Standard situation, you're 3 feet away from someone, indoor light, take a quick picture, and it generally works pretty well. Every once in a while, I'll get ambitious and want to do something a little bit more artsy, a little more sophisticated, and then you put the camera in manual mode, and you can adjust the f-stop and all the other settings yourself. And this is a really nice design for a camera, and it turns out it's a very nice design for a lot of things, because it allows you to navigate the trade-off between efficiency and flexibility. So the point-and-shoot settings are highly efficient, but they're not very flexible. But that you can use them most of the time, because most of the time we're dealing with things that we've dealt with before, and so we've got a reliable program for it. And then the manual mode is not very efficient. You have to know what you're doing. You can make a mistake, but it's highly flexible. You can do anything in principle with the manual mode. And not only is this the basic design of the camera, I think this is the basic design of the human brain. And actually, a beautiful sort of treatment of this idea is in Dano Kahneman's new runaway bestseller, Thinking Fast and Slow, which I'll mention a little bit later. So to just give you an example from outside the moral domain, there's this nice study done over a decade ago by Baba Shiv, and I don't remember the other author's first name, where they had people come into the lab. This was a kind of consumer choice experiment, and they had people doing this kind of memory test, and on the way they said, oh, there's a little cart where there are some snacks. It had fruit salad, it had chocolate cake. And some people were given a 2-digit number to memorize, and 40% of those people chose the chocolate cake. Other people were given a 7-digit number to keep in mind as they're walking past the cart, and 84% of the people, at least the ones who rated themselves as impulsive, chose the cake. What's going on here? Well, the idea is that there is a cognitive mechanism that allows you to say, you know what, chocolate cake is tasty, I really like that now, but I would rather have a slimmer waistline 3 months from now, and so I'm going to forego this immediate gain for a larger reward later. So this is delay of gratification. And what's notable about this is that the idea is that having this extra cognitive work interferes with your manual mode, which is, for the neuroscientists or people who want to learn more about it, as a rough first approximation, the prefrontal control network. So here's how this, there have been other brain imaging experiments, and more recently a TMS experiment where you actually interfere with the manual mode with a magnetic pulse, telling this basic story. So what you have, pushing for chocolate cake, so to speak, or money or whatever it is, the immediate reward, you have basic reward circuitry, which was evolutionarily conserved across mammals, although, of course, different from species to species in certain important ways. So your ventral striatum, which we'll talk about a little bit, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which, as I'll explain later, plays a more general role, but takes signals from the ventral striatum and other places and integrates them into decisions. And then you have your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is probably the most central structure for manual mode, for taking the path of greater resistance. And so these players and others will come up over and over again. But the idea is that the human brain has the same general design as the camera. We have automatic settings, gut reactions, intuitions that tell us what to do. But then we can also override them if we think that in this particular situation, that's actually not the best thing to do. Okay. So now, in a sense, what I'm saying about moral psychology, about morality, is that it looks like the rest of the brain. It looks like the rest of decision-making. And so the dual process theory of moral judgment looks something like this. And this was, at least in my case, born out of thinking about philosophical dilemmas. So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the trolley problem. For the uninitiated, I'll walk through a couple of the basic versions. So here you have this trolley that's headed towards these 5 people. And the only way you can save them is to hit a switch that will turn the trolley away from the 5 and onto the 1. And most people say that this is morally acceptable. So what's going on? Well, what the theory says is that on the one hand, in manual mode, we say 5 lives for 1. That sounds pretty good. We do a kind of cost-benefit calculation. And we could have had a strong negative emotional response to doing this, but in this case, we don't. And as a result, most people end up saying, yes, this is acceptable. And this kind of judgment is consistent with a moral philosophy known as utilitarianism or consequentialism more broadly, which is essentially applying cost-benefit analysis to the moral domain. We should go with the greater good when making decisions. Not always necessarily in every case, but that should be our bedrock values, trying to make things go well. And then we have the contrasting footbridge dilemma. The trolley is headed towards the 5 people, and this time the only way to save them is to push this large guy off of the footbridge. He lands on the track, and he'll get squashed by the train and die, but it'll prevent the trolley from running over these 5 people. And we're assuming here that you cannot jump yourself. Yes, this will actually work. We've done studies showing that even when you take into account people's assumptions about what would happen in the real world, people still say that this is generally not okay. So why is that? Well, the theory says we have the same kind of 5-for-1 cost-benefit reasoning, but in this case, and I'm sorry that the emoticon didn't work out on the going from Mac to PC, so you're going to be looking at these bleary eyes for the rest of the talk, but this is a strong negative emotional response to the thought of pushing the guy off the footbridge. And this negative response is consistent with, not uniquely associated with, but consistent with, whoa, how did that happen? Is consistent with a deontological or more broadly Kantian orientation where you say, yes, costs and benefits are important, but there are certain things that are just wrong. It would be a violation of someone's rights. It would be a violation of your duty to do that, and there's more, that there are certain constraints on what we can do even in the pursuit of good consequences. Now, I know there are a lot of philosophers in the audience, and so I want to make clear that when I call this judgment a utilitarian judgment, I'm not saying that you have to be a card-carrying utilitarian, subscribing to the whole philosophy to make this judgment. What I'm talking about essentially is cost-benefit analysis. And when I call this a deontological or Kantian judgment, I'm certainly not saying that Kant would say that a judgment made on the basis of an emotional response is the kind of judgment that he would necessarily want to endorse. This is Kant's grave in Königsberg, and then this is the direction of rotation as I put his picture next to the screaming emotional guy. These are what I call characteristically consequentialist or utilitarian and characteristically deontological judgments. And if you want to fight about this later, we can fight about the terminology. Okay, so what is the evidence for this view? I'll talk about, this is not my own evidence, but I think it's probably the strongest kind of evidence we have so far, at least among the strongest. I assume most people have heard of Phineas Gage, so this is the brain of Phineas Gage with the famous iron spike through it. So Phineas Gage, for those of you who don't know, was this very upstanding, respected railroad foreman working in Vermont in the 19th century. As a result of an accident at work, he got this tamping iron that went under his eyes and up through his skull and damaged his medial prefrontal cortex, including the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And the funny thing about this, if you can call it funny, is that his a lot of his quote-unquote cognitive faculties, so things like his ability to speak, his ability to do math, his ability to hold up his end of an intense conversation, that seemed to be fine. But his character and his decision-making abilities seem to have gone out the window. He became a kind of lawless wanderer. And there are modern-day patients, most famously studied by Antonio Damasio and other colleagues at Iowa, who have studied these kinds of patients. And what you find is that by having the ventromedial prefrontal cortex damage, they seem to lack the emotional responses that would ordinarily guide people towards good decisions. So what happens when you give people cases, let's say, like the footbridge case? Well, if it's a negative emotional response that's making people say no, and you block out the brain region that is responsible for integrating these emotional signals, then you might expect this. And that's exactly what Leanne Young and other people have found. This is, for example, Leanne Young and Judd Koenig's paper from Nature in 2007, showing that patients with this kind of damage are, depending on the question, up to 5 times more utilitarian in their judgment. So a really strong effect, and provides nice evidence that indeed there's some kind of emotional response that makes you say, no, don't push the guy off the footbridge. But even if that region is damaged, this other system, which we can sort of loosely call manual mode, is still intact, and as a result, people tend to go in a more utilitarian direction. And since then, there's been a lot of other evidence along these lines from patients and otherwise. If you look at healthy people in a brain scanner while they're making these judgments, when they make the utilitarian judgments, you see increased activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So manual mode, roughly the same part of the brain that allows you to say, you know what, I'm going to have the fruit salad instead of the chocolate cake. Now, if this were a longer talk, I would go through all of the lots and lots of evidence showing what that experiment that I just described showed you, which is that it seems that it's an automatic emotional response that's making people say no to things like pushing the person off the footbridge. That is, doing some kind of harm to somebody in the name of the greater good. And so there were the original brain imaging studies that I did, and one by Walter Sinnott Armstrong and his colleagues. There are now 4 different studies of patients with ventromedial damage. This really lovely study using electrical recordings of the scalp showing similar results with a strong immediate emotional response correlated with the judgment. Studies of psychopaths, alexithymia is a disorder in which people are kind of out of touch with their emotions. Psychophysiology, so sweaty palms. Molly Crockett will be talking about her work with psychopharmacology. Personality questionnaires, do you like to go with your gut or do you like to think things through? All of these studies point to the idea that it's an emotional response that's behind these non-utilitarian judgments. Okay, so now I'm just going to tell you about a couple of new twists on this. So this is some work done with my postdoc, Eleanor Amit. And so the question is, where does that emotional response come from? And I think the answer is complicated, but one possibility is that you have this kind of movie in your mind. You actually sort of picture in some sense, not necessarily just visually, but in a sensory way, these events. And then your emotional response is, at least in part, a response to what you're actually picturing. So Eleanor's idea to test this was, well, let's see what happens if we look at people who are better or worse at visual thinking or interfere with people's visual thinking. So the first thing she did was she gave people 2 different kinds of matched memory tests. She gave people a memory test with shapes and gave people a memory test with words. Everybody does both. You subtract the 2 scores, and that gives you an index of whether or not a given individual is relatively visual in their kind of thinking or relatively verbal in their kind of thinking. And the prediction is that if it's a visualization leading to an emotional response, leading to the judgment, then people who tend to think more visually or tend to be better at visual thinking, they will be less utilitarian. And that's what we found. So the people who were better at the shapes version, they're the ones who are down here, tended to be less utilitarian. And then she took it a step further and said, well, what if we give people a visual task or a different kind of task while they're doing it? What if we disrupt people's visual imagery about the moral judgments by giving them shapes to think about? Or as a control, we can do the same thing with words. And she found exactly what she predicted, which is that you get more utilitarian judgment when you disrupt people's visual imagery by having them do a visual task at the same time. But when you do an equally difficult non-visual task that's matched for content, you don't get the same effect. So part of what's going on here is that it seems there's a kind of sensory representation that's at least partially responsible for triggering that emotional response. Now, I showed you a bunch of papers that were supporting the emotional side of the dual process story. What about evidence about manual mode? What about evidence about reasoning and cognitive control? There are a whole bunch of experiments, this as well. So some of my original work and work with others like Fiery Cushman, putting people under other kinds of cognitive loads. This is like the study with the with the chocolate cake and the fruit salad. A cognitive load will slow down utilitarian judgments, but not the other ones. I'll tell you about this study in a second. TMS, individual differences questionnaire. So a lot of evidence supporting the idea that it's reasoning and controlled cognition on the other side here. So now I want to tell you about one recent experiment done by Joe Paxton and Leo Unger along with me. So they used something called the cognitive reflection test, which was developed by Shane Frederick and later used in a similar way by Angel Pinillos. The cognitive reflection test works like this. So you get questions like this one. A bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Now, almost everybody's first thought is 10 cents. But if you think about it a little bit more, you realize that's not the right answer. $1.10 would be 90 cents difference. The right answer is 5 cents and $1.05. Simple math if you do it, but most people's first thought is wrong. And so, two ways you can look at this. If what's going on in cases like the footbridge case is you have an intuition that says go one way, and then you have further reflection and reasoning that says go the other way, then people who tend to be more reflective should be more utilitarian, on average. Now, this may not apply to philosophers who've been trained to think in non-utilitarian ways and with their explicit training. Nevertheless, among the general public, this is what we saw. That is, the people who did better on the cognitive reflection test, the people who said, you know, I'm not going to trust my first instinct, I'm going to stop and think and do the math, those people were more likely to give utilitarian judgments. And also, in some cases, we found that you could actually induce people to make more utilitarian judgments by having them do the cognitive reflection test first. That is, it gives you an experience of, oh boy, I better not be trusting my first thoughts. I have to think more about things in general. So, there's an interesting study done by Guy Kahan, who's here, where Kahan and colleagues essentially said, well, I believe you, what you said before, that in these trolley kinds of dilemmas, it really is the characteristically deontological judgment that's driven by the emotion, and it really is controlled reasoning, rule application that's on the utilitarian side. But all this work has been with those dilemmas. There may be just as many other cases, just as interesting other cases, where it goes the other way, where the utilitarian response is the intuitive response, and where the characteristically deontological response is the one that's actually counterintuitive. Now, I think it's obvious that there are going to be cases in which the greater good is also an intuitive thing. And is it okay to kill someone because you don't like them? No. That's not for the greater good, and intuitively that also seems wrong. The interesting question is, are there counterintuitive, characteristically deontological judgments? That is, are there cases where people will say, you must follow this moral rule despite the greater good, and people do that, and people do that in a kind of top-down, manual mode sort of way. Now, I actually thought that it was possible that there would be cases like this. And I actually, in a chapter I wrote called The Secret Joke of Kant's Soul, I suggested where there might likely be exceptions. And the exceptions I thought were actually, what I predicted, were pretty close to what Kahan and colleagues had in mind. So I'll focus on one example from their study. This is, in this case, called the white lies case. There's a young man whose uncle recently passed away. And his uncle didn't like it, but his uncle was kind of a jerk. And the young man asks you, what did my uncle really think of me? And the question is, should you break this guy's heart and tell him that his uncle didn't like him? Or should you tell a white lie and say, yeah, your uncle thought you were great? And the idea with this case is that the intuitive thing to do is to not break the guy's heart. And that would also be for the greater good. So this is a case in which the utilitarian answer is intuitive. And then the idea is that if you're going to say, no, you must not lie, this will be a Kantian top-down rule being applied in the face of intuition. And that actually sounds plausible to me. And Kahan and colleagues ran some examples like this in the scanner, and they found, I would say, in my opinion, others may disagree, not terribly strong evidence that these deontological judgments are more utilitarian, more activity in the anterior cingulate, which is involved in the prefrontal control network, but it's not the DLPFC. It's not what I would call the signature of applied cognitive control. And then also some evidence from the reaction time data, although equivocal in some ways. So I was curious about this and wanted to try to do this with what I think would be a more definitive behavioral test. So what we did was we used the cognitive reflection test, as I described on the last slide, ball in the bat kinds of questions, with one of our old dilemmas and the white lie dilemma. And the question is, are people going with their intuitions when they when they say, are people going with their intuitions when they say you must not tell a lie, and applying a top-down rule, or using manual mode, so to speak, when they say no, you must not, or is it the other way around? So first, we replicated our results. We didn't use the footbridge case because our subjects are getting sick of it, but we used a similar case that Kahan and colleagues also used called the Sophie's Choice dilemma, which if you've seen the movie, you can imagine what this is about. And we conceptually replicated our finding. That is, the less intuitive people are, the less willing people are, and the better they do on the ball bat kinds of questions. The people who say, I'm not going to trust my first instinct, I'm going to think this through, those people are more utilitarian, which is exactly what the dual process theory predicts. Now, the alternative view suggests that when you look at the other case, things should go in the opposite direction. That is, that the people who are being less intuitive, those should be the people who are going to be less utilitarian, because it's the utilitarian response that's the intuitive one in this case. But what we found is actually perfectly consistent with the dual process theory. That is, the people who are less intuitive, saying, I'm not going to trust my instincts, I'm going to think, they're the ones who say, you should go ahead and tell the white lie. So I wasn't even sure this was going to work out, but this is quite striking confirmation, I think, of the dual process theory, because this dilemma was specifically chosen, can I try to find a counterexample to this? And it's one that I actually thought would be a plausible counterexample, but it turns out, at least here, not the case. It seems that the people who are doing the more utilitarian thing are also putting their instincts aside in the name of some kind of more reflective response. Okay. A lot of people ask me, trolleys, that's all very interesting, but what does this have to do with the real world? And you may hear John Haidt say some things along these lines later in the talk. And I think that that's a legitimate question. And so working with a wonderful undergraduate student, Katie Ransohoff, and then also Douglas Melton and Dan Wickler, who's a philosopher at the Harvard School of Public Health, we wanted to see if trolley psychology applies to more realistic kinds of medical cases. So Katie came up with a bunch of cases that have the trolley kind of structure, rights of the individual versus the greater good, things like rationing drugs and equipment and organs, so denying it to one person in order to have them for people where they can do more good, quarantining an infectious patient for the sake of others, denying someone expensive treatment that they need in order to save the resources for cheap prevention for a lot more people. So you can see how these are trolleyological, but they're also much more applied and realistic. And so the first thing is just, does what people say about trolleys predict what people say about these more realistic real-world dilemmas that people in medicine and public health deal with? And the answer is yes. That you can get a pretty good purchase on what people are going to say about these medical dilemmas if you look at what they say about these footbridge cases. Okay, so that suggests that it's a kind of common psychology. Then we wanted to see, well, how does this really apply in the real world? Now, unfortunately, your IRB is not going to let you kill some people for the sake of others. So you have to kind of get at this in a more indirect way. So what we decided to do was to look at doctors and people in public health. And the idea is that when you're a doctor, you're in charge of, your duty is to the patient in front of you. But when you're in public health, the patient is the society as a whole. And so you might expect people in public health to be more utilitarian. And the nice thing about this is that if this is true, it's got to be a real-world phenomenon. People weren't sorted into their careers in medicine or public health based on how they responded to some hypothetical dilemma. It's either real-world self-selection for the profession or real-world training in the profession. But either way, it's something going on in the real world. And just as Katie predicted, on both the old trolley kinds of cases and on our new medical cases, people in public health are more utilitarian than the doctors. And interestingly, the doctors look just like ordinary people. So when we gave this just to regular subjects, their ratings were almost exactly the same on average as the doctors. So this is nice evidence that this kind of stuff applies to real life and death situations, the kinds of things that people in public health and in medicine are trained to deal with. Okay, part two. Now, I've told this story about automatic responses and controlled responses, and in fact, the new story is a little bit more subtle. These signals get integrated, much as the rivers in Pittsburgh get integrated. So I want to tell you about a couple of studies done with Amitai Shenhav designed to get at this. So what we normally ask people to do is to make an all things considered judgment. And this requires, we think, two different things that are distinct. One, you have some kind of emotional assessment. How bad does it feel to be pushing this person off the footbridge? And then you have your utilitarian assessment. Okay, well, on balance is this for the greater good and by how much? And in this study, what we wanted to do is try to separate out these components. So instead of just having people respond to the dilemmas, we gave them three different ways to respond. You can just say which action will produce better results. That's the utilitarian assessment. Which action do you feel worse about doing and how much? That's the emotional assessment. And now, all things considered, which do you find more morally acceptable? Of course, there may be some of each of these going on in all of them, but the idea is that giving them the different tasks will emphasize one part of this more than the other. So first, consistent with previous results, when people are specifically doing the utilitarian assessment, you see more activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Familiar old news. Emotional assessment. Here, what we see is if you ask people, how bad does this feel? The worse people say that this action feels, the more signal you see in the amygdala. So hold that thought. And so what this suggests is that this is kind of in some way registering the badness of the feeling of the action. And then what about the all things considered integration? Interestingly, when you compare the all things considered judgments to the other two kinds of judgments, sorry, going back to PC here, what you get is more activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex when you have to put these two things together and make an all things considered judgment. So this is consistent with a lot of research nowadays indicating that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is not a kind of automatic reaction place. What it is a kind of hub for integrating all different kinds of affective signals that can bear on decision making. So this is consistent with a lot of the literature in neuroeconomics. I think that Jim Woodward is going to be talking about some of this research and its relation to moral judgment. It also, I think that this picture is highly consistent with, where's James Blair? James Blair, the line that James Blair has been pushing for a long time. But the important thing to note is that this can't just be completely neutral. Because if you recall, the patients who have damage to this area are wildly utilitarian. So if this was just neutral, that is, if everything was perfectly symmetrical here, then you would just expect the people with damage here to just be noisy. They should just be all over the place. But instead what you see is they have this dramatic shift to the manual mode side, to the utilitarian side. And this is what I think is, this is why the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is still part of this dual process story. Because even if, I think what's going on is that the amygdala, to get its yaoi signal out, it has to go through the VMPFC. But manual mode has another route out. Manual mode can duke it out in the VMPFC, but if the VMPFC isn't there, if there's nothing to fight over, it can have a direct rule-based manual mode control of behavior. I'll explain more about what that means later if you want. And I should say that the amygdala, the level of signal in the amygdala predicts the all things considered judgments that they make. The more amygdala signal, the more people are likely to say, no, it's not okay to push the guy off the footbridge, etc. Okay, another study done by Amitai Shenhab. Here we're talking about rescuing people. So the typical situation in this study, you're in this rescue boat and you're headed towards this one person whose life you can save. They're drowning, there was a storm. And then you got a call saying, wait a second, there are these other people over here. If you change course, you could save this other group of people. And one thing you want to know is, how many people over there? And what are the odds that you'll actually save them? There could be another boat that would come in time and then you'd have let this person die for no good reason. So to make a reasonable decision about this, you have to take into account the magnitude, how many other lives are at stake if I'm going to change course or not, and the probability. What are my odds of actually doing any good in saving them? And we wanted to see what's going to integrate this kind of information, what's going to keep track of it and integrate it. And you can think of it the way economists think about this in terms of the expected value. So you have to keep track of both of these variables and then put them together in a reasonable kind of way. Now, if people were just pure utilitarian number crunchers, then what you would see is as the number of people goes up, the magnitude, and the odds of saving them and the odds that you'd actually save them goes down, you would just see this kind of sharp cutoff where people would say, when do I get an expected value of 1 and switch over? But that's not what people tend to do. Instead, what you see is a kind of more graded response where people think about the number of lives at stake, they take that into account, and they think about the probability, but they're not actually multiplying out the factors. They're just weighing these in a more informal way. Okay, and I'll come back to that in a second. So first, a brain region that's been shown to respond to representations of risk in other contexts is the anterior insula, and we found that in this task, the more sensitive people's insulas are to the risk factors, the more sensitive their behavior is. So it seems that the insula, the anterior insula, is tracking risk in these cases just as it does in economic decision making. And then there are other brain regions that I'm not going to get into that seem to be tracking the magnitude. And now the question is, what's putting it together? What's responding to the combination of how many people is it, what are my odds of saving them? And it's, among other things, our friend, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So this is more evidence that this region is playing this kind of integrative role, where it's taking into account different pieces of information and using that to guide decision-making. The ventral striatum, which I mentioned before, this is the part of the brain that, among other things, says chocolate cake, woohoo, I'd like to have that now. The ventral striatum seems to be sensitive to the magnitude. It's also sensitive to this interaction, to the probability and the magnitude multiplied together. So the more sensitive, so it's doing the same kind of thing as the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and they're probably, in neural terms, talking to each other. They're densely interconnected. Okay, so seen a lot of evidence that emotional responses are affecting people's judgments. You've got your amygdala, which is in some sense responding to the moral badness of things like pushing people off of footbridges. You've got the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is integrating these kinds of signals. But what out there in the world are we actually responding to? And this is where we get closer, I think, to having direct relevance for normative questions. So going back to the trolley case, here's a little diagram here. The trolley is headed towards the 5 people, and you can push the guy. Now he's a guy with a big backpack off the footbridge and onto the tracks. In a sample, actually, there's a lot of people we surveyed here in Washington Square Park when I was still a grad student at Princeton. In this sample, about 30% of people say it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge. So this is just familiar old news. Now, to just give you one of many variations on this, in this case, you can, instead of pushing the guy, you're here on this switch, and you can drop him through a trap door that will drop him onto the tracks, and he'll die, and it'll stop the train. If you give a second group of people this question, the number of people who say that it's okay doubles. So people think it's if you're pushing versus hitting a switch. Now, some of you chuckled. I want to point out that that was a normative chuckle, and I want you to remember your normative chuckle when we get to part 4 of the talk. And what other experiments have shown is the key element here seems to be pushing. You push with your hands. You push with a pole even. That feels bad. Do it with a switch, even if it's near, even if it's far. That doesn't seem as bad. Now, this is not the only thing that's going on here. There are other, perhaps more normatively respectable factors at work. But this is at least one key factor that is, that is in the mix. Okay. Another famous set of dilemmas coming originally from Peter Singer. In the early 70s, Peter Singer made the following observation and posed a question. He said, look, if there was a child who was drowning right in front of you, and you could save that child's life, but you're going to muddy up your fancy Italian suit, is it okay to let the child drown because you don't want to ruin your suit? And I won't even poll you. Everybody says, no, you'd be a horrible moral monster if you were to do this. And then he said, okay, across the sea, there are children who are essentially drowning in poverty. And a relatively small donation on your part can probably save a child's life, giving much needed food and medicine. Or is it okay for you to for you to not donate more of your disposable income than you're currently donating, at least, in order to save those people? And most of us say, you know, it would be very nice if you did that, but that's not obligatory. So there are a lot of differences between these cases. And so what another wonderful undergraduate, Jay Musin, and I wanted to do was, let's see if we can do a more tightly controlled experiment and figure out what's really going on here. So we did a whole lot of variations on these, and I'll just give you what I think is the most essential comparison. So in one version, which follows on work done by Peter Unger. Is Peter Unger here, by the way? No, Unger? Okay. Peter Unger is at NYU. I think he's still here. It works like this. You're on vacation in this poor but lovely country, and you have your little cottage in the mountains overlooking the sea, and there's this devastating typhoon that devastates the villages below. And international aid organizations are on the scene, and they're helping, but it's really tight. They need all the resources, all the money they can get. Do you have a moral obligation to give a substantial donation to help the relief effort that's going on just below you, and just below your cottage? And here, in our sample, 68% of people said that you have some obligation to do this. And then we tried to make this as close as possible, maybe not perfect, but I think pretty good. We said, in this version, you're not over there on vacation, your friend is over there on vacation, and your friend has a little smartphone and is showing you everything that's going on. You see everything your friend sees, you hear everything your friend hears, and you can donate online just as easily as your friend can donate. We gave other people this version. How many people say you have an obligation to help? The number comes in at about half. Now, again, I think that there's a kind of normative thought that a lot of us have when we see this kind of thing. Hold on to that thought. Another thought, a bit more speculative. one thing that we noticed and that others have noticed about these cases where you're saving people's lives is that there seems to be a kind of diminishing returns. That first couple of lives, or first life, first couple of lives, that means a lot. And then as you get up to 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 lives, the value that people place on it, if you look at their behavior, tapers off in this kind of logarithmic function. Now, why would that be the case? I mean, why is the 100th life that you save worth any less than the second life that you save, right? But this is how people seem to behave when they make these kinds of judgments. And Paul Slovic has done interesting work on this, among others. Well, here's a possible explanation. Here's a hypothesis. Remember I showed you that basic mammalian reward circuitry seems to be keeping track of these values in these hypothetical moral dilemmas. Well, what is it like to, let's say, be a rat foraging for food? What kinds of rewards was mammalian reward circuitry designed for? It wasn't designed for making decisions about saving other people's lives, probably. It was designed for things like foraging for food. Should I go for the big food over there, but it's less likely to be there? Or should I just take the small food over here that's almost certainly going to be there? And it makes sense for things like food, because if you're a rat, you don't have a refrigerator. And you can only hold so much in your stomach. With basic rewards for animals, you hit diminishing returns pretty quickly. And so this is a hypothesis, but it's possible. Okay, I'll try to wrap it up. Okay, well, I'll leave it at that. Is it possible that this curve, which may or may not make much sense in the moral context, is a result of the kind of circuitry that we're using to think about these things? Now, some of you don't care about this at all, but I'm obliged to respond to this paper by a philosopher named Salim Berker called The Normative Insignificance of Neuroscience. In Berker, most of the paper is about sort of philosophical arguments. The paper also begins with a critique, or rather a spirited critique of some of my work. And given that time is short, I'm going to be even quicker than I thought I was going to be. In terms of the substance of the paper, I'm going to respond to that implicitly in what's coming up. But I wanted to point out that there are a number of mistakes, errors, and misleading statements in this paper. For those of you who care, the rest of you don't, you can turn out. He says that the reaction time analysis in my 2001 paper is statistically invalid. This is not true. This is an analysis that we would have been required to do if we had not done it. He says the same of an analysis in my 2008 paper. Also not true in another set of experiments, the ones that I described to you with pushing versus hitting a switch. He says that we unwittingly provided an alternative explanation for our results, but actually we controlled for this alternative explanation. I'm not going to get into more details about this here because we're not here to talk about statistics and experimental design. But for those of you who came to hear what I have to say about Berker, I recommend that instead you go to this set of notes that I prepared for a conference that we both attended. You can scroll down to the bottom of my webpage. His discussion is also quite misleading because he ignores most of the evidence. I explain that here. In the interest of time, I'm not going to get into this in any more detail. The main thing that he says is that you can't derive an ought from an is, even if you're a neuroscientist, and that I'm guilty of trying. And so now let's get to this business. And I'm sorry I'm going to go a bit over, but this is what a lot of people want to hear, so I'll be as quick as I can. Okay, so we come back to the is-ought problem. I don't think that you can derive moral answers from scientific data, find out how people think, and then that will just tell you how people ought to think. And I don't think that neuroscience has any transcendent power to do this. And a lot of people seem to think that if it's neuroscience, I think, or other people think that somehow it has this magic power that will allow you to figure out what's right or what's wrong. That's bunk, and I've never said anything like that. So the question is, how can cognitive science or cognitive neuroscience matter? I think it does, and I'm going to try to explain how it does. So it can reveal the specific and general limitations of our moral intuitions and cast doubt on theories, moral theories that depend on these intuitions. So let me give you an example from outside, at least the domain of this research. So the idea is that science can let us trade a difficult ought question for an easier ought question. It doesn't get rid of the need for moral judgment outside of science, but it allows us to do things that we couldn't otherwise do. So how does this work? So take a difficult question. Do capital juries make good judgments? And then we get this unfortunate bit of science that tells us that capital juries are sensitive to race. And now we have this other, now we don't have an answer yet. We have to answer this question. Ought capital juries be sensitive to race? But this is an easy question for us. Science doesn't answer this question, but it's an easier question than the one that we started with. And by combining this interesting bit of science with this easy bit of moral judgment, we get a new and interesting conclusion. Capital juries often do not make good judgments. Now let's apply the same method to the moral case. So Do people make good judgments when confronted with moral dilemmas? That's kind of the most pertinent question for what we've been talking about. And then there's some of the scientific is that we discussed. People's moral judgments are sometimes sensitive to things like personal force, pushing versus hitting a switch, or mere spatial distance. How far away are the people who I could help? And now, this doesn't settle the question. We have to ask ourselves, ought our judgments be sensitive to these things? And here's where your normative chuckle comes in. Most of us have the sense, gosh, that sure is strange. Why should we care about pushing with a switch versus pushing, or hitting a switch versus pushing with our hands, etc.? And this allows us to answer new, difficult ought questions. We can say, if that's what we're responding to, then people sometimes don't make good judgments in response to dilemmas like these. So there's no is-ought blurring here. What the science is doing is allowing us to trade, as I said, a difficult ought question for an easier one by giving us information about what our judgments are based on, and then allowing us to react normatively to that informational basis. Now, you might say, okay, well, those are behavioral experiments. What does the neuroscience have to do with any of this? I think the neuroscience is really just part of the story. And I almost wish I could rename this conference something other than the moral brain, because there's this general sense that it's brain, brain, brain. And that's at least not how I look at it. I see neuroscience as one source of relevant evidence. The real question is, going back to the camera analogy, how reliable are our moral intuitions? And what neuroscience can do is can tell us about the systems that are involved in making these judgments. Sometimes they're reliable. This is the sort of story of Malcolm Gladwell's Blink. But sometimes they're not. Take the case of learning how to drive. You wouldn't want to just get in a car and try to drive based on instinct. And this is a central message of Danny Kahneman's recent book. You wouldn't want to bank on cognitive miracles. That is, it would be a cognitive miracle if you could drive, get behind the wheel and drive like a skilled driver for the first time. Well, why is that? Well, driving is not an innate skill. It's not something that we can do just based on cultural familiarity. And it's not something that we can do based on personal experience. Otherwise, you wouldn't be learning. So it would be a cognitive miracle if you could just get into a car and drive. And likewise, and this is the main point of the general dual process story that is supported by neuroscience, among other things. It would be a cognitive miracle if our moral intuitions were completely reliable. So when are they likely to be unreliable? I see two warning signs. When we're dealing with distinctively modern problems, things that are the moral equivalent of learning to drive an automobile, our intuitions are likely to go astray. Not guaranteed, but likely. And when we disagree, when we have competing intuitions, well, at least someone's intuitions have got to be wrong. That's a sign that we might want to shift into manual mode. Should we carve out our amygdalas and our VMPFCs? A lot of people think, isn't it a problem for your view that the people with the brain damage are the ones you agree with? Look, carving out your amygdala is cutting off the whole leg to get rid of the Achilles heel. Right? It's, the point is not that we should jettison all of our intuitive responses, but rather that we should have them, but then reflect on them on a case-by-case basis. So bringing this back to philosophy, I think that what's going on is that in a lot of moral philosophy, and especially in the Kantian and deontological vein, what's really going on is rationalization. We have automatic emotional responses that say, you must not lie, or you must not masturbate. One of Kant has a rational argument against masturbation. And then what Kant and others do is they try to come up with theories that justify what they feel. Well, if there's a problem with our feelings, if they're automatic settings that are efficient but not very flexible, then all of the thinking that you're doing to justify your intuitions and to organize your intuitions is still bound to the limitations of those intuitions. Is there an alternative? I believe that there is. And this is the utilitarian tradition begun by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Utilitarian thinking, I think, is not just intuitive. It's not just utilitarian intuitions. I think Henry Sidgwick got it right, that there's a certain kind of evaluative premise that's behind this idea that we should be going for the greater good, but it's not a gut reaction to particular actions or particular classes of actions, what he calls dogmatic intuitions or perceptual intuitions. It's a general framework that says, let's put aside what we feel about particular cases and think about what's for the greater good. Obviously, there's much, much more to be said about this. I'm writing a whole book about this, but in the interest of time, I won't say anything more. So what I generally want to know is, can we trust our intuitions to deal with the most important problems that we face? Things like coming to a fair agreement about global warming. How do we respond to a terrorist attack? What should we do about the poor people who we can help? And then a host of issues in bioethics, stem cell research, which gives a lot of people icky, disgust feelings and such like that, organ donation. I won't go into these in detail, but the worry is that we're relying too much on our automatic settings and not enough on manual mode because our automatic settings are not designed by genes or by culture or by our individual experience well enough to handle these things. So to summarize, our brains have efficient automatic settings. We have emotional responses that guide us, and those are generally good, but they're not perfect. They have problems. Our brains also have a manual mode that can allow us to overcome the limitations of our automatic settings. And as I see it, our challenge as moral citizens is to learn when to point and shoot and when to put ourselves in manual mode, and to use our capacity for moral reasoning, not to rationalize what we feel, but to actually try to get beyond the limitations of what we feel. And to sum up in a single sentence, I don't think that science can give us the answers by itself. This is a common misconception about people think I and others like me are saying. But I don't think, moving forward, that we can get good answers without science. We have to understand scientifically the psychological tools that we bring to our job as ethicists. So thanks very much. Sorry.